So if you're looking at applying for your organization's tax exempt status and you're looking at the EZ version of the Form 1023 EZ, then how do you know whether or not you qualify, right? What makes a nonprofit organization small for purposes of that form? So the first thing that you have to look at is the organization's annual gross receipts, right? And they must be less than $50,000. So the IRS will look at any money the organization has raised in each of the past 3 years, as well as what you project the organization will raise in each of the next 3 years. Now, obviously, financial projections are not an exact science, right? But the projected revenues that you're telling the IRS you're predicting here should have some relationship to not only your projected expenses, but what you're telling the IRS you're actually planning to do, right? Even nonprofit organizations can't operate at a budget deficit year in and year out, right? So there has to be a plan for keeping and making this organization sustainable. So, can the nonprofit realistically fulfill its program objectives on less than $50,000 per year? If you can say that with a straight face, right, you can make that determination and be reasonable about it, then you can probably use Form 1023 EZ. But if you're telling the IRS we're planning on hiring a dozen people and buying a building and doing all these other very expensive things, then it's really hard to qualify to use Form 1023 EZ. The other qualification, and this is typically not as big of a concern, but in addition to looking at your gross receipts, the IRS also considers the fair market value of the organization's assets. And the organization must have less than $250,000 in assets to qualify for Form 1023 EZ. So if you're projecting less than $50,000 a year in revenue, typically you'll also have less than $250,000 in assets. A few other things that might hang you up if you're looking at using Form 1023 EZ. One, you cannot be a nonprofit LLC. Ohio used to allow this. It looks like they've stopped, but some states might still be allowing that as a formation option. Again, it's not a great idea. It just makes your life harder and more complicated. It means you've got to use the more complicated standard 1023 application. So if your state still allows the formation of nonprofit LLCs and you're planning to be a small nonprofit, don't do that. You also cannot be a successor organization to a for-profit business. So if you are converting from a for-profit business to a nonprofit, that will raise a red flag with the IRS. You won't be able to use the EZ version of the application, okay? Similarly, your nonprofit will raise that same red flag if you're taking over assets from a for-profit business or you're taking over the activities of a for-profit business. And you can't just circumvent this by dissolving the old for-profit and then starting up a new nonprofit with the same officers and the same directors or the same key management people involved, right? The IRS is still going to look at that and say that new nonprofit is a successor to the for-profit business because the two organizations have the same management. So I often see this in the real world when an entrepreneur starts up a business. They're not really sure if it's a for-profit, a nonprofit, a social enterprise, where it fits in kind of that mold. So they'll start it as a for-profit LLC, and then they'll realize, okay, I'm actually doing a lot of social good here. I'm doing a lot of charitable work. I want to be able to apply for grants, so I need to become a nonprofit. And so they'll try to shift the activities over into a new entity or try to convert the for-profit to a nonprofit. And again, that'll raise these red flags with the IRS. And because of that, you won't be able to use Form 1023 EZ. Same thing if your nonprofit, if you're working with a nonprofit organization, it had its tax exempt status, it lost it, right? And then your new organization is now a successor to that entity. That can make it difficult for you to use Form 1023 EZ. The one exception is that if you were a small nonprofit, you lost your tax exempt status because you didn't realize or forgot or whatever the case might have been, but you weren't filing the organization's annual 990, the nonprofit version of a tax return. So if you lost your tax exempt status for that reason, the IRS will still allow you to use Form 1023 EZ, but otherwise, if you're sort of inheriting this nonprofit from another entity, you probably can't use Form 1023 EZ. Couple of other exceptions, churches. So because of the whole separation of church and state, churches, and when I say churches, I'm including, all types of religious worship facilities. So mosques, temples, synagogues, right? Any place that regularly meets for some form of religious worship. The rules around churches are a little bit strange because of that separation of church and state. Churches generally don't have to apply for recognition of their tax exempt status. Many of them choose to do so that they'll have the official determination letter and the sense of legitimacy that comes with that letter. But unfortunately, churches and associations of churches cannot apply using Form 1023-EZ. And finally, there are a few other activities that will prevent you from applying for your tax exempt status using the EZ version of the form. Those would be things like schools, hospitals, certain research organizations, certain cooperative service orgs, what they call supporting organizations, which I won't get into, credit counseling or those types of service organizations, organizations that plan on forming partnerships or joint ventures with for-profit businesses, organizations that have or plan to have donor advised funds. So if you fall into one of those very specific categories, then you probably won't be able to use Form 1023-EZ. Now, the good news is that's a lot of information, but there is an eligibility worksheet included with the instructions for Form 1023-EZ that'll help you make sure that you qualify and you're filling out the right form before your startup organization wastes money paying the IRS an application fee and then finding out, oh, you lost your fee and you filled out the wrong application.